The doctor was humiliated in front of everyone by the arrogant millionaire days later. He begged her to save his life. Sometimes the cruelest moments in our lives become the very foundations upon which our greatest strength is built. The fluorescent lights of St. Catherine's Hospital buzzed overhead as Mary Rodriguez adjusted her scrubs for what felt like the 100th time that morning. At 25, she had been working as a registered nurse for 3 years, but her youthful appearance often led people to underestimate her capabilities. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and despite the exhaustion that came with 12-hour shifts, her brown eyes still held the compassionate spark that had drawn her to nursing in the first place. The emergency department was particularly busy that Tuesday afternoon. Ambulances had been arriving steadily since dawn, bringing in victims from a multi-car accident on the interstate. Mary had been running between patients, administering medications, checking vital signs, and providing comfort to frightened families. Her uniform bore the evidence of her dedication: small stains from helping patients, wrinkles from constant movement, and the slight dampness of perspiration from her relentless pace. Brian Whitmore stepped through the hospital's main entrance with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. At 35, he had built a tech empire that had made him one of the youngest billionaires in the country. His Italian leather shoes clicked against the polished floor as he strode toward the reception desk, his tailored suit impeccable despite the chaos around him. His jaw was set in the familiar expression of someone accustomed to immediate attention and unwavering service. Brian's assistant had called ahead about his visit to check on his elderly housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who had suffered a heart attack earlier that morning. However, the emergency department's triage system didn't recognize wealth as a medical priority, and Brian found himself waiting like everyone else. The concept of waiting was foreign to him, and his impatience grew with each passing minute. When Mary approached the reception area to retrieve a patient file, Brian's frustration finally boiled over. He had been watching her move efficiently between tasks, noting her youth and assuming incompetence. To him, she represented everything he perceived as wrong with the healthcare system: young, inexperienced staff who couldn't possibly understand the urgency of his situation. Without warning, Brian's voice cut through the busy atmosphere like a blade. He began berating Mary publicly, his words sharp and cutting. He questioned her qualifications, her age, her ability to handle serious medical situations. His voice grew louder as he called her completely useless and suggested that the hospital's standards had clearly declined if they were hiring children to handle life-and-death situations. The reception area fell silent, except for Brian's continued verbal assault. Other patients, visitors, and staff members turned to watch the spectacle unfold. Mary felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as Brian's words echoed off the walls. She had encountered difficult people before, but never had someone attacked her so personally and publicly. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to maintain her professional composure, but inside, she felt small and powerless. What made the situation even more painful was Brian's dismissive tone when he mentioned Mrs. Chen's condition. He spoke about the elderly woman as if she were property rather than a human being, focusing more on the inconvenience her illness caused him than on her actual well-being. Mary's heart ached, not just for her own humiliation, but for the way this man seemed to view other people as disposable. The other hospital staff members watched helplessly as their colleague endured the public humiliation. Some wanted to intervene, but Brian's obvious wealth and status created an invisible barrier. The hospital administration had always emphasized the importance of maintaining good relationships with prominent community members, and Brian Whitmore was certainly that. Mary finally managed to excuse herself and retreated to the supply closet, where she allowed herself a few moments to process what had just happened. Her dedication to her profession had never been questioned so brutally and in such a public forum. She thought about her patients who depended on her care, her colleagues who respected her skills, and her own journey to becoming a nurse, despite financial hardships. As she wiped away the tears that had threatened to fall, Mary made a silent promise to herself. She would not let this man's cruelty diminish her passion for healing others. She would continue to be the nurse she had trained to be, compassionate, skilled, and dedicated to every patient who needed her care, regardless of their status or attitude. If this story is touching your heart, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories. Also, leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from and what time it is there. We love connecting with our global community. The aftermath of public humiliation has a way of seeping into every corner of a person's life. like water finding cracks in seemingly solid foundations. Mary's shift continued for 6 more hours after the incident with Brian Whitmore, but the sting of his words lingered with each task she performed. Every time she entered a patient's room, she found herself second-guessing her actions. When she administered medications, she triple-checked dosages she would normally verify twice. When she spoke to families, she wondered if they too saw her as too young or inexperienced to be trusted with their loved one's care. The other nurses on her floor had witnessed the confrontation, and their supportive glances throughout the remainder of her shift only served to remind Mary of what had occurred. Sandra, a veteran nurse with 20 years of experience, approached Mary during their brief dinner break. Without saying a word about the incident directly, Sandra began sharing stories about her own early career challenges, her voice gentle but firm, as she emphasized how experience came not from age but from dedication and continuous learning. Dr. Patricia Williams, the attending physician Mary worked with most frequently, also made a point of acknowledging Mary's excellent patient care during evening rounds. She praised Mary's attention to detail and her ability to anticipate patient needs, comments that would normally make Mary feel proud, but now felt like well-intentioned attempts to rebuild her confidence. When Mary finally left the hospital that evening, the city's lights blurred through her tired eyes as she sat in her modest sedan in the parking garage. The contrast between her beat-up car and the luxury vehicles surrounding it seemed more pronounced than usual. She thought about Brian Whitmore's obvious wealth and the power it gave him to humiliate others without consequence. Mary's apartment was a small one-bedroom unit in a converted house about 15 minutes from the hospital. The rent consumed nearly half her monthly salary, but it was clean, safe, and close enough to work that she could walk when her car needed repairs. She had decorated it simply with items from thrift stores and a few pieces her mother had given her when she graduated nursing school. That evening, Mary sat at her small kitchen table with a cup of tea and her laptop, reviewing the latest medical journals she accessed through the hospital's online library. This had always been her routine, staying current with medical research, learning about new treatments and procedures, constantly improving her knowledge base. Tonight, however, the routine felt different. She found herself questioning whether her efforts were enough, whether she was truly qualified to make the life and death decisions her job required. Her phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother, Carlos, who was studying pre-med at the local community college. He had always looked up to Mary as his inspiration for entering healthcare, and his message was a simple check-in about her day. Mary stared at the phone for several minutes before responding with a generic, "Fine, just tired" response. She couldn't bring herself to tell him about the humiliation she had endured. Sleep came fitfully that night. Mary found herself replaying the scene at the reception desk, imagining different responses she could have made, different ways she might have defended herself. In some versions, she was eloquent and strong, calmly listing her qualifications and achievements. In others, she walked away with dignity and tact, but in reality, she had simply stood there and absorbed the verbal assault, her training in patient care and professionalism providing no guidance for such a personal attack. The next morning brought its own challenges. Mary arrived at the hospital early, as was her custom, but she found herself taking the stairs instead of the elevator to avoid the main lobby where the incident had occurred. She knew this avoidance was temporary and ultimately unhelpful, but she needed time to rebuild her emotional strength. Her patient assignment that day included a young mother recovering from emergency surgery and an elderly man dealing with complications from diabetes. Both patients required careful monitoring and frequent medication adjustments, tasks that demanded Mary's full attention and expertise. As she worked with them throughout the morning, she began to remember why she had chosen nursing as her profession. The young mother, despite her own pain, thanked Mary repeatedly for the gentle way she administered medications and checked incisions. The elderly patient, initially frightened and confused, visibly relaxed when Mary took time to explain each procedure and medication in terms he could understand. These interactions reminded Mary that her value as a nurse couldn't be measured by one cruel man's opinion. During her lunch break, Mary walked to the hospital chapel, a quiet space she sometimes visited during particularly difficult shifts. The non-denominational room was empty, except for a few scattered prayer books and the soft sound of instrumental music playing through hidden speakers. Mary sat in one of the simple wooden chairs and allowed herself to feel the full weight of the previous day's events. She thought about her journey to become a nurse, the financial struggles, the The long hours of studying while working part-time jobs, the clinical rotations where she had proven herself capable time and again. She remembered the patients she had helped comfort during their final moments, the families she had supported through devastating diagnoses, the colleagues who had come to respect her skills and judgment. By the end of that lunch break, Mary had made a decision. Brian Whitmore's words had wounded her, but they would not define her. She would continue to grow as a nurse, continue to provide compassionate care, and continue to prove through her actions that dedication and skill mattered more than age or appearance. Life has a peculiar way of bringing people back together, often under circumstances neither could have predicted or prepared for. 3 days had passed since the humiliation at the reception desk, when Mary arrived for her Thursday evening shift. The hospital's pace had returned to its usual rhythm after the chaos of the multi-car accident earlier in the week. Mary had spent those 3 days rebuilding her confidence through her work, focusing intently on her patients, and finding strength in their recoveries and gratitude. The emergency department had been relatively quiet that evening until around 9 o'clock, when the automatic doors burst open and paramedics rushed in with a critical patient. Mary looked up from the medication cart she was organizing to see the controlled chaos that always accompanied life-threatening emergencies. Dr. Williams was immediately called to Trauma Bay 3, and Mary could hear the urgent communication between the medical team. As she continued her routine tasks, Mary caught fragments of conversation from the trauma bay. The patient was male, mid-30s, found unconscious in his office by security personnel. Initial assessment suggested a massive heart attack, complicated by what appeared to be drug interactions from prescription medications. The paramedics had managed to restart his heart twice during transport, but his condition remained critical. Mary was assigned to assist with the patient's care, gathering necessary supplies and preparing for potential emergency procedures. As she approached Trauma Bay 3 with an armload of medical equipment, she stopped short when she saw the patient's face. Despite the oxygen mask and the pallor of near death, she immediately recognized Brian Whitmore. The man who had publicly humiliated her just 3 days earlier now lay unconscious and vulnerable on the trauma table. His expensive suit had been cut away to allow medical access, his perfectly styled hair was disheveled, and his usual aura of power and control had been replaced by the universal fragility of human mortality. For a moment, Mary felt frozen. The professional part of her mind catalogued his vital signs and medical status, while another part wrestled with complex emotions. Here was the man who had called her useless and incompetent, now completely dependent on the very medical professionals he had dismissed. Dr. Williams looked up from the patient and noticed Mary's hesitation. The doctor's expression showed concern, thinking perhaps Mary was overwhelmed by the severity of the case. Without knowing the connection between Mary and the patient, Dr. Williams asked Mary to assist with monitoring his cardiac rhythm while the team worked to stabilize his condition. Mary pushed aside her personal feelings and stepped into her professional role. She attached monitoring electrodes with the same gentle care she showed all patients, checked the IV lines that were delivering life-saving medications, and carefully documented his vital signs. Her training took over completely as she became part of the team fighting to save Brian's life. The next several hours were critical. Brian's condition fluctuated between stable and life-threatening multiple times throughout the night. Mary remained at his bedside, part of the rotating team of nurses who monitored his care around the clock. She watched the cardiac monitor, adjusted medication drips as ordered by the physicians, and performed the countless small tasks that could mean the difference between life and death. During one of the quieter moments, when Brian's vital signs had temporarily stabilized, Mary found herself really looking at him for the first time since the incident. Without his usual expression of arrogance and impatience, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. She noticed the lines of stress around his eyes, the tension that remained even in unconsciousness, and wondered what had driven him to such a state of health crisis at such a young age. Dr. Williams later explained to the nursing team that Brian had apparently been working excessive hours, consuming large amounts of caffeine and energy supplements, and taking prescription stimulants that had not been properly monitored by a physician. The combination had put enormous strain on his cardiovascular system, ultimately leading to the massive heart attack that nearly killed him. As Mary continued her vigil, she thought about the irony of the situation. Brian had questioned her qualifications and abilities, yet now his life literally depended on those same skills. She could have requested a different patient assignment, could have let another nurse take over his care, but something inside her refused to abandon her professional responsibilities, regardless of how he had treated her. Throughout the night, Mary demonstrated the very competence Brian had so publicly questioned. She caught subtle changes in his condition that less experienced staff might have missed, anticipated the physician's needs during emergency procedures, and maintained the meticulous documentation that would be crucial for his ongoing treatment. Near dawn, Brian began showing signs of regaining consciousness. His eyelids fluttered occasionally, and his responses to painful stimuli improved. The medical team was cautiously optimistic that he would survive, though the full extent of any permanent damage wouldn't be known until he was fully awake and could be properly assessed. Mary's shift was ending, but she found herself reluctant to leave. Part of her wanted to be present when Brian fully awakened, curious about whether his near-death experience might have changed his perspective. Another part of her dreaded the possibility that he might resume his cruel treatment of hospital staff once he recovered. As she gathered her belongings to leave, Mary took one last look at the man who had so deeply wounded her pride just days earlier. He looked peaceful now, his breathing steady and his color improved from the grayish pallor of the night before. Despite everything he had said to her, she felt a sense of professional satisfaction in knowing she had played a role in saving his life. The moment when someone emerges from the edge of death often brings clarity that was previously hidden beneath layers of pride and assumption. Brian's return to consciousness was gradual, like surfacing from deep water. First came the awareness of sounds, the steady beeping of monitors, the soft whisper of oxygen flowing through his mask, the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. Then came the realization that he couldn't move easily, that his body felt foreign and weak, connected to machines and tubes that seemed to be keeping him tethered to life itself. When his eyes finally opened fully, the harsh fluorescent lighting of the intensive care unit made him squint. The ceiling tiles above him were marked with small water stains, a detail he would never have noticed in his previous life, but now seemed to occupy his entire field of vision. As his awareness expanded, Brian began to piece together fragments of memory. Working late in his office, feeling chest pain, calling for help, and then nothing until this moment. Dr. Williams was the first medical professional to speak with Brian once he was fully conscious. She explained his condition in clear, professional terms. He had suffered a massive heart attack brought on by a dangerous combination of stress, overwork, and misuse of stimulant medications. The damage to his heart was significant, and his recovery would be long and uncertain. The doctor's words hit Brian with unexpected force. In his world of business deals and corporate strategies, problems always had solutions. Obstacles could be overcome with enough money or influence. But lying in that hospital bed, connected to machines that were literally keeping him alive, Brian encountered perhaps the first situation in his adult life that his wealth and status couldn't immediately fix. As the day progressed, Brian became more aware of his surroundings and the people caring for him. The ICU nurses moved with quiet efficiency, checking his vital signs, adjusting medications, and monitoring the various machines that surrounded his bed. He noticed their gentle professionalism, the way they explained what they were doing even when he was too weak to respond, the careful attention they paid to his comfort and dignity. It was during one of these routine checks that Brian first recognized Mary. She entered his room to replace an empty IV bag, her movements confident and sure as she worked with the equipment. Brian's memory of their previous encounter was hazy at first, clouded by medications and the trauma his body had endured. But as he watched her work, the details slowly came back to him. Mary, for her part, maintained complete professionalism during their interactions. She spoke to Brian in the same gentle, informative tone she used with all patients, explaining procedures and asking about his comfort level. If she harbored any resentment about his previous behavior, it wasn't visible in her care or demeanor. Brian found himself studying Mary's face as she worked. Without the filter of his previous arrogance, he began to notice details he had missed before. The careful precision of her movements spoke of extensive training and experience. The way she anticipated his needs before he could voice them demonstrated a deep understanding of patient care. The gentleness with which she handled tasks that could have been performed more roughly showed a level of compassion he hadn't expected. During one particularly vulnerable moment, when Brian was struggling with nausea from his medications, Mary stayed with him longer than necessary, helping him through the episode with patience and kindness. She adjusted his pillows, brought him ice chips to ease his dry mouth, and spoke in soothing tones that helped calm his anxiety. It was then that Brian began to truly understand what he had done at the reception desk. The young woman he had publicly humiliated was not only qualified and competent, but possessed the very skills and compassion that were now saving his life. The realization came with a weight of shame that felt almost as heavy as his physical pain. Over the following days, as Brian's condition gradually stabilized, he found himself thinking more and more about Mary and his behavior toward her. He began to remember other instances in his life when he had dismissed or mistreated people he considered beneath his status. The memory of his cruel words echoed in his mind, made more painful by his current dependence on the very person he had attacked. Brian also began to reflect on the path that had led him to this hospital bed. His relentless pursuit of success had cost him relationships, health, and apparently his basic human decency. The empire he had built suddenly seemed less important when viewed from the perspective of someone who had nearly died alone in his office, discovered only by a security guard making routine rounds. The wealthy businessman who had entered the hospital 3 days earlier, as an arrogant, demanding visitor, was slowly being replaced by someone forced to confront his own mortality and the consequences of his actions. The machines that sustained his life served as constant reminders of his vulnerability, while the care he received from people like Mary demonstrated a kind of strength and nobility he had never bothered to recognize before. As Brian lay in his hospital bed, watching Mary and the other medical professionals work tirelessly to help him recover, he began to understand that true power didn't come from money or status. It came from the ability to heal, to comfort, to dedicate one's life to serving others in their most vulnerable moments. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but the foundation was being laid for a man who might emerge from this experience fundamentally changed from the one who had entered it. In the quiet hours of recovery, when pain medication creates spaces between thoughts, the human mind often wanders to places it has long avoided. Brian's 4th day in the ICU brought a different kind of awareness. The immediate crisis of his heart attack had passed, but the long road to recovery stretched ahead of him like an uncharted territory. His body, once a reliable machine that carried him through 18-hour workdays and high-stress negotiations, now required help with the most basic functions. The humbling nature of his dependence on others was perhaps the most difficult aspect of his recovery. Mary continued to be one of his primary nurses, and Brian found himself both dreading and anticipating her visits to his room. Each interaction reminded him of his cruel behavior, yet her consistent professionalism and gentle care also provided comfort during his most vulnerable moments. He began to notice the small details of her work that spoke to her expertise, the way she could start an IV on the first try, her ability to spot subtle changes in his condition before the monitors reflected them, and her skill at managing his complex medication regimen. During one afternoon shift, Brian witnessed Mary caring for another patient in the bed across from his. An elderly gentleman had been admitted with complications from surgery, and his family was clearly struggling with fear and confusion about his condition. Brian watched as Mary took extra time to explain medical terms in language the family could understand, helped them navigate the hospital's visitor policies, and provided emotional support that went far beyond her basic nursing duties. The contrast between Mary's patient, compassionate care and Brian's memory of his own behavior became stark and undeniable. He remembered how dismissive he had been about Mrs. Chen's condition, how he had treated her illness as an inconvenience rather than a serious concern for a human being who had served his household faithfully for years. Speaking of Mrs. Chen, Brian realized he had no idea about her current condition or recovery. During his own medical crisis, he had been unable to check on her, and now he felt ashamed that his first thought upon regaining consciousness hadn't been concern for her well-being. He made a mental note to ask about her condition once he was stronger, though he wondered if he had forfeited any right to information about her care through his previous behavior. As the days passed, Brian began to engage in longer conversations with his medical team. Dr. Williams explained that his recovery would require significant lifestyle changes, dietary modifications, regular exercise, stress management, and ongoing cardiac rehabilitation. The cardiologist painted a picture of a very different future from the high-pressure, high-stakes business life Brian had previously lived. These medical consultations often took place when Mary was in the room, performing routine care tasks or monitoring his condition. Brian noticed how she listened intently to the doctor's explanations, occasionally asking clarifying questions or offering insights about his responses to medications. Her questions demonstrated a deep understanding of cardiac care that went far beyond what Brian had assumed about her qualifications. One evening, when the ICU was quieter and Mary was adjusting his pillow to help him sleep more comfortably, Brian found himself studying her face in the dim lighting. She looked tired, the kind of exhaustion that comes from caring for critically ill patients through long shifts. Yet there was no trace of resentment in her expression, no sign that she was providing anything less than her best care, despite how he had treated her. Brian's business mind began to work through the implications of what he was observing. In his corporate world, people who were mistreated often sought revenge or, at minimum, withdrew their best efforts. Yet Mary continued to provide exceptional care to the very person who had publicly humiliated her. This level of professionalism and dedication suggested a strength of character that Brian was only beginning to appreciate. The realization that began to form in Brian's mind was uncomfortable and unavoidable. He had completely misjudged not only Mary's qualifications and competence, but also her character and integrity. His assumptions had been based on superficial observations, filtered through his own arrogance and prejudices. The young woman he had dismissed as useless was proving herself to be not only highly skilled, but possessed of a moral strength that he was beginning to recognize he lacked. Brian also began to think about his employees and business associates. How many talented, dedicated people had he dismissed or undervalued based on similar superficial judgments? How many opportunities for genuine human connection had he missed because he viewed others primarily through the lens of their utility to his objectives? The monitors around his bed continued their steady rhythms, marking time and vital signs, but also serving as reminders of his mortality and the fragility that connected him to every other human being in the hospital. Wealth and status had provided no protection against the fundamental vulnerability of the human condition, and the people who had saved his life were those whose value he had failed to recognize. As Brian drifted off to sleep that night, helped by medications that Mary had carefully administered according to his doctor's orders, he carried with him a growing understanding that his recovery would need to involve more than just healing his damaged heart. It would require examining and possibly rebuilding the assumptions and attitudes that had led him to treat others so poorly. Sometimes the most powerful apologies come not from words, but from the gradual recognition of one's own profound dependence on another's grace. Brian's transition from the ICU to a regular cardiac care unit marked a significant milestone in his recovery, but it also brought new challenges. He was stronger physically, able to sit up for longer periods and take short walks with assistance, but his increased awareness also meant a sharper focus on the emotional and psychological aspects of his ordeal. Mary had been assigned to continue his care on the cardiac unit, a continuity that Brian found both comforting and troubling. Her presence provided stability during his recovery, but it also served as a constant reminder of his shameful behavior. Every time she entered his room with her characteristic, gentle professionalism, Brian felt the weight of words he couldn't take back. The cardiac care unit had a different atmosphere from the ICU. Patients here were generally more alert and interactive, and Brian found himself observing the dynamics between staff and patients throughout the unit. He watched Mary move from room to room, providing care that was consistently excellent regardless of the patient's attitude, background, or demands. In the room next to Brian's, an elderly woman named Dorothy had been recovering from heart surgery for over a week. She was known among the staff for being difficult and demanding, constantly complaining about everything from the food to the room temperature to the timing of her medications. Brian observed how Mary handled Dorothy's complaints with patience and understanding, never showing frustration or providing lesser care despite the woman's constant criticism. The contrast with his own behavior became more painful with each observation. While Dorothy's complaints were at least related to her medical care, Brian's attack on Mary had been purely cruel and personal. He had questioned her fundamental competence and worth as a professional, based on nothing more than his own impatience and arrogance. Brian's business associates began visiting as news of his heart attack spread. These visits revealed another layer of his growing self-awareness. His colleagues spoke about work with the same intensity and single-minded focus that had characterized Brian's life before the hospital. They updated him on deals, contracts, and corporate strategies, but their conversations felt increasingly hollow and disconnected from what seemed important now. During one such visit, Brian's business partner Marcus mentioned having to deal with incompetent staff at one of their properties, dismissing a maintenance worker who had apparently made an honest mistake. The casual cruelty in Marcus's tone, which would have seemed normal to Brian just weeks before, now struck him as unnecessarily harsh and destructive. Mary was in the room during this conversation, quietly checking Brian's IV line and monitoring his vital signs. Brian noticed her slight reaction to Marcus's dismissive comments about the worker, a barely perceptible tightening around her eyes that suggested she was all too familiar with such attitudes. The moment passed without comment, but it reinforced Brian's understanding of how his own behavior had affected her. As Brian's physical strength gradually returned, he began to participate more actively in his own care. Mary taught him how to monitor his pulse, explained the purposes and side effects of his various medications, and guided him through the gentle exercises prescribed by his physical therapist. Her teaching was patient and thorough, never condescending despite his obvious lack of medical knowledge. These educational sessions became opportunities for Brian to observe Mary's expertise more closely. Her explanations were clear and comprehensive, demonstrating a deep understanding not just of nursing procedures, but of cardiac physiology, pharmacology, and rehabilitation principles. The breadth of her knowledge impressed Brian and made his previous dismissal of her qualifications seem even more ignorant and unfounded. One afternoon, while Mary was helping Brian practice the breathing exercises that would aid his recovery, he found himself studying her hands as she demonstrated the technique. They were the hands of someone who had dedicated her life to healing others, gentle but confident, bearing the small calluses and minor scars that came from years of hands-on patient care. Brian began to wonder about Mary's background and motivation for becoming a nurse. What had drawn her to a profession that required such dedication and often received so little recognition? How many other patients had benefited from her skills and compassion? How many lives had she touched in ways that went far beyond medical treatment? The businessman in Brian also began to calculate the economic value of Mary's contributions. Her skills prevented complications that would cost the hospital thousands of dollars. Her attention to detail caught problems before they became emergencies. Her compassionate care improved patient satisfaction and recovery times. By any measure that Brian understood, Mary was an exceptionally valuable professional. Yet he had dismissed her worth based on superficial impressions and his own impatience. The injustice of his behavior became more apparent with each passing day, as did his growing gratitude for her continued excellent care despite how he had treated her. Brian's recovery was progressing well, and he knew that soon he would be discharged from the hospital. The thought of leaving brought mixed emotions, relief at returning to independence, but also anxiety about losing the protective environment where Mary's care had become such an important part of his healing process. More significantly, he realized that his discharge would likely end his contact with Mary, possibly forever. The thought of leaving without addressing his behavior toward her felt increasingly unacceptable. But Brian struggled with how to approach such a conversation. What words could possibly acknowledge the depth of his misjudgment and express his gratitude for her grace in continuing to provide excellent care? Finding the right words to acknowledge profound wrong requires more courage than most people possess. Yet sometimes survival depends on that very courage. Brian's 7th day on the cardiac unit brought an unexpected visitor, his housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, who had recovered sufficiently from her own heart episode to be discharged. The elderly woman appeared in his doorway with a small bouquet of flowers from her garden, her face showing the familiar mixture of concern and formality that had characterized their relationship for the past 5 years. Seeing Mrs. Chen brought Brian's behavior at the hospital reception desk into sharp focus once again. He remembered his dismissive attitude toward her condition, how he had spoken about her, as if she were property rather than a human being deserving of concern and respect. The shame he felt was almost physical in its intensity. Mrs. Chen approached his bedside with the quiet dignity that Brian was only now learning to recognize and value. She asked about his condition in simple English, her accent more pronounced due to her own recent medical stress. Brian found himself truly listening to her for perhaps the first time in their years of acquaintance, hearing not just the words, but the genuine concern behind them. During their conversation, Mrs. Chen mentioned how kind the nurses had been during her hospitalization, particularly a young nurse named Mary, who had taken extra time to explain procedures and ensure her comfort despite the language barrier. The elderly woman's face brightened as she described Mary's patience and gentleness, not knowing that she was speaking to the very person who had so cruelly attacked that same nurse. Brian felt his chest tighten, not from his cardiac condition, but from the weight of his shame. Here was independent confirmation of Mary's exceptional character and professional skills, delivered by someone who had no knowledge of the connection between her patient and her visitor. Mrs. Chen's gratitude toward Mary stood in stark contrast to Brian's own behavior. After Mrs. Chen left, Brian spent the afternoon in deep contemplation. The visit had reinforced his growing understanding of how fundamentally he had misjudged not only Mary, but his entire approach to interacting with others. His worldview, built on assumptions about status, wealth, and worthiness, was crumbling under the weight of reality. Mary's afternoon shift began with her usual rounds, checking on each patient with the same careful attention she had shown throughout Brian's stay. When she reached his room, Brian felt his pulse quicken, not from his heart condition, but from anxiety about the conversation he knew he needed to have with her. For the first time since regaining consciousness, Brian attempted to engage Mary in conversation that went beyond medical necessity. He asked about her nursing education, her experience at the hospital, and her thoughts about patient care. Mary responded professionally but cautiously, perhaps sensing that something had shifted in their dynamic. As Mary worked, checking his vital signs and adjusting his medications, Brian found himself struggling with how to begin the apology he knew he owed her. The words seemed inadequate for the magnitude of his behavior, yet he recognized that his silence was perhaps even worse than his original cruelty. Brian's first attempt at acknowledgement was clumsy and insufficient. He mentioned that he hadn't been feeling well on the day he had come to check on Mrs. Chen, implying that his behavior might be excused by his own impending medical crisis. Mary listened politely but offered no response that would let him off the hook so easily. Recognizing that his initial approach had been another form of deflection, Brian tried again. This time he spoke more directly about his behavior at the reception desk, acknowledging that his words had been inappropriate and unfair. Mary continued her work, her expression neutral but attentive. The conversation that followed was perhaps the most difficult of Brian's adult life. Accustomed to boardrooms where power dynamics were clear and negotiations followed predictable patterns, he found himself completely out of his depth when trying to address the human cost of his cruelty. Mary's responses were measured and professional. She acknowledged his apology, but didn't offer immediate forgiveness or reassurance. Her dignity in the face of his attempt to make amends was both inspiring and humbling. She neither punished him with coldness nor absolved him with easy acceptance. What struck Brian most powerfully was Mary's simple statement that she had continued to provide him with the best care possible because that was what her profession demanded, regardless of personal feelings. The strength of character required to maintain such standards in the face of public humiliation was something Brian was only beginning to comprehend. As their conversation concluded, Brian realized that his apology, while necessary, was only the beginning of a longer process of understanding and change. Mary's grace in accepting his words without making the moment about her own vindication demonstrated a maturity and strength that humbled him further. That evening, alone with his thoughts and the steady rhythm of the monitors, Brian began to understand that true redemption would require more than words. It would require fundamental changes in how he viewed and treated others, changes that would need to be demonstrated through actions rather than promises. The conversation with Mary had been a crucial step, but Brian recognized it as the beginning, rather than the end of his journey toward becoming someone worthy of the care and respect he had received during his darkest hour. True transformation occurs not in grand gestures, but in the quiet moments when someone chooses to see others through the lens of their own humanity, rather than their usefulness. Brian's recovery had progressed to the point where discharge was being discussed for the following week. This milestone, which should have brought relief and celebration, instead filled him with an unexpected sense of loss and urgency. The protected environment of the hospital, where Mary's care had become a cornerstone of his healing, would soon be just a memory. Dr. Williams had outlined Brian's post-discharge care plan during morning rounds. The cardiologist emphasized that his recovery would be a long-term process requiring significant lifestyle changes, regular follow-up appointments, and careful adherence to his medication regimen. The doctor also mentioned that Brian would need home healthcare support during his initial weeks of recovery, particularly for monitoring his cardiac status and ensuring proper medication compliance. As Dr. Williams discussed the home care arrangements, Brian found himself hoping that Mary might be involved in his continued care. However, he quickly realized that his desire for her continued presence was selfish and possibly inappropriate, given their history. Mary's skills were needed here at the hospital, caring for patients who required the intensive support that only a hospital environment could provide. That afternoon, Brian witnessed an interaction that would stay with him long after his discharge. A new patient had been admitted to the cardiac unit, a middle-aged construction worker named Roberto, who spoke limited English and was clearly frightened by his surroundings and medical condition. Brian watched from his doorway as Mary spent extra time with Roberto, using her basic Spanish and hand gestures to communicate comfort and reassurance. Mary's patience with Roberto was extraordinary. She repeated explanations multiple times, drew simple diagrams to help him understand his condition, and even found a Spanish-language pamphlet about heart attacks to help him better comprehend his situation. Her efforts went far beyond the basic requirements of nursing care, demonstrating a level of dedication and compassion that Brian was learning to recognize as Mary's standard approach to every patient. The scene reminded Brian of Mrs. Chen's earlier description of Mary's care during her own hospitalization. Language barriers, cultural differences, and social status meant nothing to Mary when it came to providing excellent patient care. Every person who came under her professional responsibility received the same thoughtful, skilled attention, regardless of their background or circumstances. Brian began to reflect on his own business practices and management style. How many employees had he overlooked or undervalued because they didn't fit his narrow definition of leadership potential? How many talented individuals had left his companies because they felt unrecognized or dismissed? The cost of his prejudices suddenly seemed enormous, not just in human terms but in practical business outcomes. During one of Mary's routine medication administrations, Brian asked her about her career plans and aspirations. He learned that she was working toward a master's degree in nursing, attending classes online during her off hours, while maintaining her full-time hospital schedule. Her goal was to eventually specialize in cardiac care, possibly becoming a nurse practitioner who could provide more comprehensive care to heart patients. The determination and sacrifice required for Mary to pursue advanced education while working demanding hospital shifts impressed Brian deeply. Here was someone who was constantly investing in her own professional development, driven by a desire to provide even better care to her patients. Her motivation stood in stark contrast to Brian's own career advancement, which had been primarily focused on increasing his wealth and status. Brian also learned that Mary was helping to support her younger brother's pre-medical education, contributing to his tuition and expenses while managing her own financial responsibilities. The generosity and family loyalty she demonstrated added another dimension to Brian's understanding of her character. As the evening shift began, Brian found himself reflecting on the broader implications of his experience. The healthcare system he had dismissed and criticized was filled with people like Mary, dedicated professionals who had chosen careers focused on serving others rather than maximizing personal gain. Their work was essential to society's well-being, yet people like him often treated them as invisible or interchangeable service providers. The monitors around Brian's bed continued their steady beeping, marking not just his vital signs, but also the passage of time in a place where every moment mattered. The hospital operated around the clock, staffed by people who had committed their lives to being present during others' most vulnerable moments. The magnitude of that commitment was something Brian had never considered before his own crisis. That night, as Mary performed her final checks before the shift change, Brian thanked her not just for her care during his recovery, but for the example she had set through her dedication and professionalism. He told her that watching her work had taught him things about excellence and service that no business school or corporate training had ever conveyed. Mary's response was characteristically humble. She simply said that providing good patient care was what she had been trained to do, and that seeing patients recover and return to their lives was the most rewarding aspect of her profession. Her lack of ego or need for recognition only served to highlight the nobility of her approach to her work. As Brian prepared for sleep, aided by medications that Mary had carefully administered and explained, he realized that his transformation was far from complete. Understanding Mary's worth and acknowledging his own failures was only the beginning. The real test would come when he left the hospital and had to apply these lessons to his daily life and business practices. The true measure of personal transformation lies not in private revelation, but in how those insights change the way we treat every person we encounter from that moment forward. Brian's final days in the hospital were marked by a flurry of discharge planning activities, but beneath the medical logistics, a deeper preparation was taking place. He was not just getting ready to leave the hospital physically, he was preparing to re-enter a world where he would need to prove to himself and others that his near-death experience had created lasting change. The discharge planning process itself became an opportunity for Brian to practice his new perspective. The social worker who coordinated his home care services was a young man named David, fresh out of graduate school and clearly nervous about working with a high-profile patient. In his previous life, Brian would have been impatient with David's careful, methodical approach and might have demanded to speak with someone more senior. Instead, Brian found himself appreciating David's thoroughness and attention to detail. The young social worker's questions about Brian's home environment, support systems, and follow-up care needs were comprehensive and thoughtful. Brian realized that David's youth and recent training were assets rather than liabilities, bringing current knowledge and fresh perspectives to the discharge planning process. When David apologized for the time the process was taking, Brian assured him that thoroughness was more important than speed, especially when it came to his health and safety. The social worker's surprised but grateful expression reminded Brian of how unusual such patients must be among his typical clientele. Mary was involved in the discharge education process, teaching Brian about his medications, warning signs to watch for, and the importance of following up with his cardiologist. Her instructions were detailed and comprehensive, accompanied by written materials she had prepared specifically for cardiac patients like himself. During these educational sessions, Brian began to understand the complexity of knowledge that Mary possessed. Her explanations covered not just the basics of medication compliance, but the intricate interactions between different drugs, the physiological processes involved in cardiac healing, and the lifestyle modifications that would support his long-term recovery. Brian asked Mary about her plans to become a nurse practitioner, expressing genuine interest in her educational goals and career timeline. He learned that she was particularly interested in working with underserved populations, bringing advanced cardiac care to communities that often lacked access to specialized medical services. The conversation revealed another aspect of Mary's character that Brian found both inspiring and humbling. Her career ambitions were not focused on prestige or financial gain, but on expanding her ability to serve patients who needed her skills most. Her vision of professional success was defined by the lives she could impact rather than the status she could achieve. As Brian's discharge date approached, he began to think about how he could apply the lessons of his hospital experience to his business life. The companies he owned employed thousands of people, many in entry-level positions that he had rarely considered important enough to pay attention to. His attitude toward these employees had likely mirrored his initial dismissal of Mary, viewing them as interchangeable resources rather than individuals with valuable contributions to make. Brian started making mental notes about changes he wanted to implement in his companies: better recognition programs for dedicated employees, improved pathways for advancement regardless of educational background, and more respectful communication at all levels of the organization. He also began to consider how his companies might support healthcare workers and other essential service providers in the community. The evening before his discharge, Mary worked her final shift as Brian's primary nurse. The routine was familiar by now: medication administration, vital sign checks, patient education reinforcement, but both of them seemed aware that this would be their last extended interaction. Brian had spent considerable time preparing for this final conversation. He wanted to express his gratitude in a way that was meaningful but appropriate, acknowledging the profound impact Mary's care had made on his recovery and his perspective. He told Mary that her example had shown him what true professionalism looked like, the combination of technical skill, emotional intelligence, and moral courage that enabled her to provide excellent care even to patients who had treated her poorly. He said that watching her work had taught him more about leadership and service than decades of business experience. Mary listened to his words with the same grace she had shown throughout his stay. She thanked him for his kind words, but redirected the conversation to his ongoing recovery needs, emphasizing the importance of following his discharge instructions and maintaining his follow-up appointments. Her response was perfectly professional, but Brian sensed that his words had meant something to her. After days of caring for someone who had publicly humiliated her, receiving acknowledgement of her skills and character from that same person carried significance that went beyond typical patient gratitude. As Mary completed her final checks and prepared to end her shift, Brian realized that their professional relationship was concluding, but the impact of their interaction would continue to influence his life in ways he was only beginning to understand. The transformation that had begun with his medical crisis and Mary's exceptional care was now his responsibility to continue and expand. The real test of his changed perspective would come not in the protected environment of the hospital, but in the complex world of business relationships and daily interactions that awaited him beyond these walls. Sometimes the most profound changes in our lives begin with the courage to admit how wrong we were and the determination to spend the rest of our days proving we can do better. Brian's discharge morning arrived with the controlled chaos typical of hospital transitions. Final medical checks, prescription reviews, transportation arrangements, and the inevitable paperwork that marked the official end of his stay at St. Catherine's Hospital. Yet beneath the administrative activities, Brian felt the weight of a much more significant transition taking place. Dr. Williams conducted the final medical evaluation, expressing cautious optimism about Brian's recovery, while emphasizing the critical importance of lifestyle changes and ongoing medical care. The cardiologist's parting words were both encouraging and sobering. Brian had survived a massive heart attack, but his long-term prognosis would depend entirely on his commitment to the difficult work of changing how he lived his life. Mary arrived for her day shift just as Brian's discharge preparations were reaching their final stages. She brought with her a folder of educational materials specifically selected for his condition and recovery needs, as well as a list of community resources that might support his lifestyle changes. Her preparation and attention to his ongoing needs, even after his discharge, demonstrated the thoroughness that had characterized her care throughout his stay. As Mary reviewed the discharge instructions one final time, Brian found himself memorizing details about her that he might never have the opportunity to observe again. The careful way she organized information to make it most useful for patients, the gentle firmness with which she emphasized critical points, and the genuine concern in her voice as she wished him well in his recovery. Brian's assistant had arranged for a luxury medical transport service to take him home, but as he prepared to leave, he realized that the lavish lifestyle awaiting him felt somehow hollow compared to the authentic human connections he had experienced during his hospital stay. The expensive car and private recovery suite that had been prepared for him seemed less meaningful than the simple dignity with which Mary and her colleagues had provided his care. Before leaving his room, Brian took a moment to write a letter that he left for Mary with the charge nurse. In it, he attempted to express the full extent of his gratitude and the impact her care had made on his life. He acknowledged that his behavior at the reception desk had been inexcusable, and that her grace in continuing to provide excellent care despite his treatment of her had shown him what true strength looked like. The letter also contained Brian's commitment to use his experience as a catalyst for change in his business practices and personal relationships. He promised to be more respectful of healthcare workers and service professionals, to recognize and value dedication and skill, regardless of age or appearance, and to use his resources to support the kind of compassionate care that had saved his life. Brian's journey home provided time for reflection on the transformation that had taken place during his hospital stay. The businessman who had entered St. Catherine's Hospital as an arrogant visitor demanding special treatment was leaving as a patient profoundly changed by his encounter with mortality and with people whose worth he had failed to recognize. The first test of his changed perspective came sooner than expected. During his first week at home, Brian noticed that his household staff, people who had worked for him for years, seemed surprised by his new interest in their well-being and his respectful communication style. Mrs. Chen, in particular, seemed cautiously pleased by his inquiries about her recovery and his genuine concern for her health. Brian began implementing changes in his business operations, starting with improved recognition programs for employees at all levels and more respectful communication policies throughout his companies. He established scholarship programs for healthcare workers, pursuing advanced education, and created partnerships with local hospitals to support staff development and patient care improvements. These changes were not just corporate gestures, but personal commitments driven by his understanding of the value and dignity of work like Mary's. Every time he interacted with service professionals, from hospital staff to restaurant servers to maintenance workers, he tried to see them through the lens of respect and recognition he had learned to apply to Mary's care. Several months after his discharge, Brian learned that Mary had been accepted into an advanced nurse practitioner program with a full scholarship. The news brought him genuine happiness, knowing that her skills and compassion would reach even more patients in need of excellent care. Brian never saw Mary again after his discharge, but her influence on his life continued to grow with each passing day. Every decision he made about how to treat employees, every interaction with service professionals, every choice about how to use his wealth and influence was filtered through the lessons he had learned from watching her work. The heart attack that had nearly killed Brian ultimately became the catalyst for the most meaningful period of his life. The near-death experience had been frightening, but the encounter with someone like Mary, whose dedication, skill, and grace under pressure had shown him what true excellence looked like, had been transformative in ways that extended far beyond his physical recovery. Brian's new understanding of human worth and professional dignity didn't eliminate all of his character flaws or solve every problem in his relationships and business practices, but it provided a foundation for growth and change that would influence every day of his remaining life. The man who had once dismissed a young nurse as useless had learned that the most valuable people in our lives are often those whose worth we fail to recognize until we desperately need what they have to offer. In Mary's case, what she offered was not just medical skill, but an example of how to live with purpose, dignity, and unwavering commitment to serving others. Brian's story became a testament to the possibility of change and the power of grace. Both the grace he had received from Mary despite his cruelty and the grace he tried to extend to others as he worked to become worthy of the care that had saved his life. The nurse who had been publicly humiliated had ultimately become the teacher who showed a broken man how to begin healing not just his body, but his soul. If this story touched your heart the way it touched mine, leave a like so more people can discover this incredible journey of overcoming. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your city. I love getting to know you.